Get started. Good evening and welcome to this special lecture on Reconceptualizing Urban Politics. This event is sponsored by the Center of Urban Studies at the University of Amsterdam and is being organized by the Urban Geographies Program Group at the Amsterdam Institute of Social Science Research, also at the UvA. I am Richard Ronald. I'm a professor in Housing, Society and Space at the University of Amsterdam. You may not know me. If you're really into rental market restructuring in South Korea, I'm huge. I've been given the task today of curating these proceedings. For those of you who are wondering, I have Googled this term. A curator is a content specialist charged with institutional collections and involved with the interpretation of tangible materials of some sort. Some sort. Sounds about right to me. I guess I'm kind of the MC and I will be rocking the mic for the next hour and a half or so. Our guest speaker this evening is Jennifer Robinson, who is Professor of Geography, of all of Geography? All of it, wow. Ambitious. At the University College London. She is a graduate of KwaZulu, I should have checked this before, KwaZulu-Natal University in Durban, in South Africa, and has a PhD from the University of Cambridge in the UK. Her work currently focuses on developing a post-colonial critique of urban studies. I guess amongst her greatest hits is her book Ordinary Cities, which looks at how the interplay between urban modernity and development frames a conceptual and practical divide between Western and Third World cities. And I guess that will be a theme, perhaps, that will come back today. Previously, she has researched the relationship between power and space, specifically in cities and especially in relation to South African politics. And I apologize if I've got any of that wrong, Jennifer, but that's what it says on the website of this event, and that's the highlights. Two local experts will be responding to Professor Robinson's lecture this evening. The first is Justus Uitermark, who is Professor of Urban Geography at the University of Amsterdam. Again, according to the blurb on the Pakhuis Zwijger website, he is both a distinguished urban geographer and a renowned urban sociologist. Two distinct fields of study that complement, inform, and inspire each other. That's some good writing, yes. Professor Uitermark has a long-standing interest in the roles of cities as terrains, a political struggle, and more recently has been studying how social media platforms facilitate challenges against the status quo or breed conformity. Our second respondent is Dr. Virginie Mamadou, who is Associate Professor in Political and Cultural Geography, also at the University of Amsterdam. She studies the political and cultural aspects of European geopolitics and integration at multiple scale levels. And that's as much as was on the website. I've worked with Virginie for 10 years, and I had to Google her this afternoon. And I realized she doesn't write much about herself on websites, but I suggest she does. And she adds distinguished and renowned somewhere as well. I know it's not you. Somebody somewhere has made the event more prestigious in this use of superlatives. The format of this evening's proceedings will be no surprise. I will invite shortly Professor Robinson to deliver her lecture, in which she will present and develop her vision of urban theory. And then I will invite the two respondents to respond for about 10 minutes each. I will then allow the guest speaker to comment on these reactions before opening up the discussion to the room. So, Professor Robinson, Jenny, the floor is yours. Please take a mic.
Hi, everyone. Is it on? Yeah? Is it working? Great. Well, thank you very much. I did ask whether the MC had some jokes for us. I realized the question was redundant for anyone who knows you clearly. So thank you for that lively introduction. It's a great opportunity to be here today. I'm so pleased to be able to come and share with you in this, what I know is a very lively world of urban studies here in Amsterdam. So I'm looking forward very much to the discussion. And I'm invited, I know, on the occasion of Sako Mustard, who's unfortunately stuck in some personal disaster today, which I'm very sorry for. But it was interesting to me to reflect on how my work might connect with his, So I realized that a lot of the themes that he writes about, concerned with questions of segregation, social justice, competitive cities, and so on, these are exactly the same themes that I've spent my entire academic life engaging with from a very different place, as we heard, starting in Durban in South Africa. And I guess this seems very appropriate to me then, given the topic that we have to think about this evening, reconceptualizing urban politics, precisely in the context of a globalized field of the urban. What does it mean that we would be writing, Sako and me, about these very similar topics from such very different places? Do we share conversation? Do we contribute to an ongoing theoretical project and scholarly community? So I think for both of us, the concerns that we have are often seen as specific variations on wider theoretical projects. So if we're thinking about urban political analysis, especially for me, it's about the politics of economic development, the politics of urban development. Is it the case that when we're looking at a city that I might be writing about, say Durban or Johannesburg, or today a bit more about London, are these just variations on some broader conceptualization which instantiates itself as theory? So I'm very much in the business of trying to cut theory down to size and insist that we can theorize from anywhere. So I'm really hoping that we can work together a little bit this evening across these interesting discussions and hopefully your questions to think what could this mean? How could we do this? How can we proceed? Now, that's a rather personal and parochial starting point for this talk tonight. But if I place that in a broader, more formal context, I would think we could perhaps agree that the need to reimagine urban politics and a theoretical project around urban politics, that this arises in response to significant empirical developments in urbanization, such as the vast expansion and fragmentation of urban settlements, the dispersal of urban forms over extended urban regions or corridors, the expanded role of globalized circuits shaping urbanizations, such as policy circuits, networks of urban actors, investment flows, which have all generated very transnational platforms for urban agency. So this provokes in us, at the very least, a real problematization of what is the territory of urban politics. So the provocations for urban studies, which have come, for example, from the insights of planetary urbanization, provide an important articulation of this challenge, thinking where is the city, what is going on with urbanization, as do the insights developed from international urban development policy, which remind us that most people moving to live in cities arrive to live in self-constructed housing and often face a life-threatening lack of infrastructure. So the problematic of urban politics, if we are thinking about it in a globalized sense, has to relocate itself from the place where much of the theorization of urban development politics has come from, which is in the US. So on the one hand, we have this kind of classic Kevin Cox, David Harvey sort of approach to thinking about urban politics, which is focused, since the 1980s. So this is now very dated literature, but I find we often return to that as the kind of norm. How do we think about what is the motivating force of municipalities, of policies around local development? So here we focus on municipalities competing for footloose capital, and out of that flowed a lot of complex and very interesting work on urban regime politics, where locally dependent municipalities and firms configured a variety of different kinds of political formations with different kinds of growth paths, different kinds of policy agendas. Now these, as we well know, and I think much of the work of people in this context and also in the UK, these traveled very poorly to Europe. Okay, so this regime theory idea of competitive municipalities having a certain interest in employment and tax generation and so on, trying to capture capital investment. In the UK, for example, it's well documented, this just wasn't going on. There's a highly centralized municipal system, very few examples of this kind of agentful local development politics. But these approaches, they traveled even worse. So if you think this was quite a big debate over a decade or so about how poorly this US theory traveled, they traveled even worse to situations where not only are business and other actors quite nationally focused, and South Africa is not a very strong local dependency of business actors. In some contexts, especially in many former colonial contexts, local government systems remain strongly centralized. And the institutional basis and scope for operation of local government is weak or highly informalized or interwoven with traditional and communal forms of land ownership. Strong transnational actors such as resource extraction companies, oils, minerals, sovereign development organizations, international NGOs, actors such as the World Bank. This brings a very different configuration to urban politics. So we've really gone a very long way from this kind of Cox-Harvey orthodoxy. Of course, many things resonate from that context, from that theorization, specifying the differential interests of different actors, the territorial bases of them. So you'll see that this continues to play a role in how we can think going forward, but I think I'm trying to suggest that we need to start someplace else. So the second kind of approach and era that shapes and frames our thinking of urban politics is that of neoliberalization. So here the sources of inspiration for analysis have self-consciously addressed this kind of US-EU bias and have tried to attend a little bit more to the dispersed origins and circuits of neoliberal practices. Although certainly a lot less considered in these discussions are places where neoliberalization took place within coercive policy circuits, or places with huge imbalances of power relations, or structural adjustment policy is not a term that comes forward often when people are discussing neoliberalization. So it still has a certain geography. Also, we haven't looked so closely at places where maybe there was no opportunity for rollback because, of course, state initiatives, state-led institutions were never present. So neoliberalization, wasn't really on the cards. Or we also have lots of contributions which stress that neoliberal innovations might have enabled developmental interventions and improved situations, brought forward possibilities for governance. So what I want to take from that line of thinking is a different kind of territorial formulation. And here I think the work also of people in this room has been very helpful here, which is the phrase that Peck, Theodore, and Brenner brought forward, that we're looking at a kind of variegated formation of neoliberalization, which seems to bring forward quite a strong role for, say, local agency, local specificity. So we have neoliberalism kind of whizzing about the world. Neoliberalization is a process, and it's variegated in different places. But in a way, all this variegation still adds up to something, a syndrome of neoliberalization. So we never really have a question about where it's going. It's going to neoliberalization. And this was the argument that Sue Parnell and I made some time ago now, which is that actually it's not clear that these processes of neoliberalization are leading to neoliberalization. They might lead to theft. They might lead to nothing at all. In the example we'll see just now, there may be a completely ineffective transmission of neoliberal policies. But I think what we have between these two poles then of the sort of thinking about the variegated politics of neoliberalization and thinking about the territorial configurations of local economic development politics is the starting point for the need to reconfigure our thinking around the urban political. And what I'm going to do is, having rehearsed, nothing happened, actually. So, let's see. Still nothing. Okay, maybe somebody can find the guy. Find the guy.
Next one?
It doesn't come up there, that's the thing.
That's
So
interesting.
I'll just keep on talking, and when you catch up, when you can work it out, we'll show some pictures.
Yes.
The last 15 minutes will need some pictures, so we can we can waffle on until then, no problem. Okay, so I think there's a growing sense as I read in the literature of a need to start to excavate a different pathway out of our analysis of urban politics. And one of the papers I was very pleased to read recently came from John Lowerman. I think it's in progress in Human Geography. And he talks about the need to revisit this classic idea of entrepreneurial urbanism. And he makes these points, which would be up in a quote, but I'll read them to you. So, entrepreneurial cities navigate geographies of interurban competition and cooperation. So we're thinking about the networks that cities are part of, prolifically many different kinds of networks, trying to cooperate to solve problems like climate change or to bring forward new kinds of development agendas and so on. He writes, the expansion of entrepreneurial practices to multiple governance agendas in parallel to growth reflects the formation of extraterritorial political coalitions. So these are transnational political coalitions. So we're not talking about local dependency or locally articulated interests, but a vast array of transnational platforms on which cities operate, plus a range of transnationalized actors who are operative in the territorialization of urban politics, whatever that territorialization would be. Now, I think that on that point, this is where the need to rethink urban politics comes in the light of what we can, as a shorthand, talk about as a kind of planetary urbanization set of provocations and questions. Where exactly are we finding the urban? What does it look like? This is not a center-out urbanization. It's not even a kind of suburbanization. As Roger Kyle points out, we have to start to think beyond the conceptual picket fence or whatever the Americans have around their properties. We have to move out of the suburbs. The urban could be pitching up all over the place, fragmented, extended, satellite cities here and there. So how do we think then about the territorialization of urban politics in this formation of the urban? So in addition, we have the long-term project of my own work has been to try and propose that to answer these questions about the urban, we need to adopt a view which could start to think from anywhere. So a post-colonial critique of the urban alongside the planetary urbanization suggests that we need to expose ourselves, if we wish to theorize the urban, to a range of different contexts. It's no good to start in the US, as I was trying to suggest in the beginning, where the urban is and where its dynamism is coming from, and the places that are good to think with are in very different places. But we don't have a lot of good examples or practices of how to do that work across a range of different urban situations. So this is where, oh goody, what did you do to achieve that? I don't want to know. Okay,
yes,
great.
I don't know.
I don't need to know. It works. Thank you. So anyway, this is where I'm going. So we've been thinking here to what do we need to do with this? The inheritance tracks. This is something that comes on one of my favorite Saturday morning radio programs in the UK when I'm tidying up the house. So rethinking the inheritance tracks we have of neoliberal and entrepreneurial urbanism. What are we going to do with these now not so helpful approaches? And then I'm going to take from them the two dimensions that are important in neoliberalism and entrepreneurial urbanism, which is one, the circuits. So we're thinking about the circulation of policies, of ideas, of investment. So if we're going to shift our thinking towards a more post-colonial and planetary perspective, what are the circuits that are to be thought about, and what do we say then about the territorializations of urban politics? And here I want to bring in ideas about a transcalar territorialization. Obviously we have to think whatever and wherever the urban might be in a way that cuts across actors with a range of different reaches and potentials. And then I'll draw this together with some ways in which we might think of the urban political not simply as the context that variegates the wider processes, but itself is a thing to think with. Beyond the context, that is the territorialized political organization of the urban is what we could start with across a number of different contexts, and where do we get to? Can we start to think from those situations? So these were the quotes that I read out to you. The top one from John Lauerman, that we have to start to think about collaboration, not just competition. We have to think about a diversity of governance agendas, not just growth. And then this is reinforced in is a really interesting recent paper about with a kind of variegated approach, but which comes down on a very strong way that it's important to be looking at the role of local agents themselves in shaping the wider processes that are associated with urbanization. We also see this, for example, in a great paper by Michelle Buckley and a collaborator who now I've moved, Hania, looking at the way in which forms of property financialization in Dubai have constituted the urban, and through making that locality have remade financial circuits. So you can say in a strong way we might be looking to localities beyond simply variegation, but to be composing urbanization processes. So in order to take this forward, this is Lauerman, so if you allow me to jump forward. As some of you may be aware, I've been spending the last decade really trying to think about, so if the wager of ordinary cities was, let every city be ordinary, let's just start again. I found a lot of difficulties with global city ideas, or with the idea that some cities were developed, some were not, some were modern, some were not. How can we start to think the urban across all different kinds of urban outcomes? Clear the ground, really. But then we need to start to think again. How do we build up new conceptualizations of the urban? And this, I've been sort of toying with the idea of comparativism. This is the main project I'm trying to bring together at the moment, Comparative Urbanism book. So I've tried to take comparison, which can be a bit of a straitjacket, can seem very much bound up with causal thinking and very scientific approaches, and loosen it so that we can use it to think across a globalized urban world. And starting, for example, with all the different kinds of urban outcomes which are the result of the circulations that tie cities together, the many different interconnections, circuits, flows, and so on, that can produce very similar looking things in different cities, that can lead to very similar policies, where we might see what we could call repeated instances. These draw us then to think across different cities. So we're drawn by the connections, by the interconnections between cities, to think quite different cities together. And I'll give you an example in a minute, which ties Lilongwe in Malawi to Johannesburg to London. So we can start to think the urban across a greater diversity of situations. The second one relies a lot more on us. So shared features, a term I use really for when an agent for researcher composes a comparison, thinks across different places, different examples, because it seems as if there would be something to think about there. There's a sensible reason to make up a comparison. It's not because you can compare London with Lilongwe, but because you've got some question you might have in mind. Maybe you find segregation strong in one place, not so strong in another. Let's try and understand that better. So these are things that we drive through our curiosity to seek to conceptualize more. And then finally, we might be very embedded in a certain case. We might spend our whole lives working on Amsterdam or Durban, but launching how we conceptualize and engage with that context into wider conversations is just as much a comparative tactic as any other. So this is kind of my mantra, that I think if we want to conceptualize, we want to reconceptualize what the urban political is, we could start anywhere. We can think with other places, with elsewhere, reach out to draw ideas from somewhere else, or to propose suggestions to other scholars. And this rests very much on thinking that whatever theory or concepts might be, they're revisable. So we shouldn't be intimidated by them, cut them down to size. They're things that we can work with, we can not work with, we can propose something else to them. We should feel very empowered to think with elsewhere, to transform our inheritance tracks, so we can say something else, sing a different song. So this is my wager in a way, and we've been pursuing a few different projects which you'll get a flavor of as I go along. So what I propose then is that on the basis of these kinds of experiments, we might bring forward insights from different contexts, which could be, I suggest 3 different things here. 1, they could be empirically additive. We are interested in a certain phenomenon, and if we look here and there and there and there, we find ourselves drawing together a fuller and fuller understanding of what a phenomenon might be and how complex and diverse it might be. So here, for example, I've been quite a fan of the Global Suburbanisms project that Roger Kyle has been coordinating across about 50 researchers from all over the world. And whatever a suburb was, it's become something very, in a way, they rushed to a minimalist definition. It's about population expansion in the context of urban growth. It's very minimalist, but whatever a suburb is whatever is there. It's filled in with a great variety of different things. So it kind of feels very empirically additive. We can produce our understandings by a rich inclusion of different experiences. Or it could be analytically subtractive. So we are interested in neoliberalization, but instead of going everywhere around the world and finding it again and again and again, we might find our case takes away from that as a reasonable explanation. We get less and less sure that this phenomenon or this concept can really help us in the next case. And eventually we might get to a situation where it's explaining almost nothing, and we're left with a great deal of difference to think with. And it's from that difference, from what we might otherwise have been calling a context, that we can rebuild our conceptualization. We could think again. So this is what I'm most interested in. And then I think pragmatically, often comparisons are quite hard to do. They change over time. You might think you're looking at this particular phenomenon, and by the time you've worked through a few cases, you're kind of looking at something quite different. It's a sort of very moving feast in my experience. But certainly, as each case comes into view, insights from the different cases can bring to light aspects of another. So they throw a new light on each other, deepen our analyses, thicken the singularities, if you like, of the different cases. So I'm going to take this as my as the background to a justification for why we can start to try and theorize whatever urban politics is from a wide range of different contexts. So partly with the inheritance tracks in mind, and partly with this proposed kind of loose methodology, I'm going to move now to look at firstly how we might build our understanding of urban studies by looking at a much greater diversity of connections, not just the kind of neoliberalizing policy, not just maybe financialized investment, maybe not certain kinds of powerful impositions by international agencies, but what are the diversity of connections and how do they work? I'm quite interested in that. We might be looking at circulations or interconnections between cities, but maybe they work in ways that we don't see if we're thinking always from the same kind of northern contexts. And then I want to suggest how, if we don't assume what the territorial basis of the urban is, i.e. the municipal state interested in certain things, how do we look at emergent territorializations? How can we think about the territorialized formation of the urban somewhere or other, in some remote place where a new city is being built, a satellite city in a field far from the center of town, or an involution of a city, a whole new concentration in the middle of an older urban complex? How can we think about the territorialization of politics? What does that look like? And then, having got that in mind, how can we start to work across different urban territories to build new insights? Can we? So hopefully there'll be enough time to give you a sense of that. So first of all, diversifying circuits. I guess we might say that connections in this kind of model of urban studies, we might look more strongly to connections as themselves the site of urban politics, not waiting for them to hit the ground or variegate themselves in some way. But we have to pay attention to the international arenas, the agencies and actors, that urban politics is happening in the circuits as much as in the territories. So we've seen, for example, the global agency of municipalities inserting their interests into global policy agendas such as the SDGs, a lot of networking amongst municipalities and other urban agents, which can become as much platforms for collaboration, but also for competition. People are angling to get benefit out of these international networks, and this then becomes a very important site of the politics of urban, territorially defined agents. And then the powerful processes of disseminating, in the case of the SDGs, of disseminating this agenda to cities and getting them to take it up, which often involves enrolling national governments as much as local governments. So this kind of opens up a range of investigations into what the power relations and dynamics of urban politics would be in the context of these globalized circuits and networks. Now, the question that I mentioned before is what is the nature then of this politics? What's going on here in these circuits and in these sites of circulation and sites of urban politics? And the example that I want to bring forward here is one which I came across from the Johannesburg side, which is an exchange between the city of Johannesburg, one of the three main municipalities in the Gauteng region in the former Transvaal of South Africa, and the capital of Malawi, Lilongwe. And for various reasons, largely linked to the agency of groups like Habitat International, the United Cities Local Government Network, the Cities Alliance, the World Bank was involved, quite a lot of nudging for Johannesburg and Lilongwe to form a partnership. And here we have the words of one of the key actors and the partner from the Johannesburg side. And from their side, they thought they should share their good practice, their governance capacity with Malawi, which is very poor, one of the poorest countries in the world, but very closely connected into South Africa. So miners and domestic workers and migrants of all kinds have been moving between South Africa and Malawi for over a century. So this is a deeply connected, two deeply connected sites. So here, Johannesburg then mostly paid for these journeys of maybe a dozen or more local officials to go back and forth to Lilongwe to work on developing a city strategy. So this was a particular technology that Joburg had got very good at, is developing a long-term city strategy, bringing different actors together, thinking about how the city might develop, initially in a post-apartheid period, but in an ongoing way. So they did a lot of work, and by about 2009, so this is a little while ago, they had developed an effective city strategy for Lilongwe. They'd confronted questions of financial corruption. They'd built close working relationships. So this is a very long way from the fast-moving, rapid circulation of neoliberal ideas and the inappropriate adoption of some policy that comes from some of the places. Very careful, official to official, careful learning. And in some ways it was a success. It led to the investment of money from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation into slum upgrading and some service and housing delivery in Lilongwe. But one of the most interesting aspects of the development is that at a certain moment the chief executive officer of Lilongwe changed, and although he'd had nothing whatsoever to do with the whole process, he put in for an award for city collaboration and development innovation, which duly came to the Joburg-Lilongwe collaboration. But Johannesburg, despite the fact they'd paid for, done all the work, they weren't invited to the ceremony. It was, so I think of this a purely specular kind of connection. High profile, big achievement, lots of kudos to somebody who hadn't done anything. So this is really to think a little bit about what do we mean as, what do we think is going on in these platforms, in these circuits of urbanization at a kind of globalized level. And the other side of it, which sounded very strong, which is the investment in slum upgrading from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, in fact, it was gained despite the fact that the achievements of the grant of the city strategy had been very much undermined by the governance problems, financial problems, and so on. So despite the fact that the Cities Alliance knew about these problems, they proposed that further investment should follow. So there's, if we're looking at this circuit, it's resting on something that is very performative, very specular, almost a kind of haunting. And it may be that we think that this is just about a weird place on the edge of the planet urban, but in fact, I was very struck after having been doing this work and thinking about this context, sitting in the London planning hearings for the London Plan, another city strategy, to hear the debates about things like not really knowing what the population of London is going to be. For example, that the legislation that's governing regional planning in the UK has been abolished. So then how is the planning inspector going to be guided as to what to do in London? Oh, he'll just use some defunct legislation from a while ago. That also seemed a bit specular to me. So I started to see some aspects of development in the town I'm living in now, which is really at the other end of the urban hierarchy, if there is one, from Lilongwe, which resonated with some of the sense that the power relations and politics of urban development may not be consistent with some of the assumptions around hierarchical, organized, bureaucratic, etc. Activities. And the other case was a bit closer to home in terms of the original case study, which is in Johannesburg, where the mayor came up with the idea of promoting certain transit corridors in Johannesburg as a way to bring low-income investment into the center of the city, to try and stitch together the segregated apartheid city, a very big initiative. And this initiative was proudly marketed long before anything had really been put in place, any substantive policy or financing or anything. So it was a big idea, it was a speculative idea. In fact, it has led to quite a lot of activity and investment, but at that time it was not very, it was really in a zone of what is completely unstable initiative. And then here is the population graph for the future population of London, recovering from its historic dip through the middle part of the 20th century, and going where? To 9 and a bit million people, over 13 million people. These numbers seem to be very vague, thrown around, uncertain. And because they're uncertain because nobody really knew whether after the last crash, the financial crash of 2008, whether people stayed in London because they couldn't sell their houses, or whether the population was really going up. It is completely uncertain. And the planners were operating in two different directions, lobbying places from outside London to please be ready to accept people, while pushing that London should be accommodating all of its population. So there was a lot of uncertainty about this situation. So I think the point I'm making here is not that we're looking to one context as kind of idiosyncratic, odd, informal, specular, but that there may be something important to learn from contexts which are highly informalized, or where the politics is uncertain and being pursued for different reasons, personal gain and so on. I mean, these are not unknown all over the place. But I think I just pause a moment around the concept of informality, for example, which at one stage, if we look back 10 or 15 years, informal housing, informal economies, these were markers of a different kind of urban, an urban that wasn't allowed to be defining what urban was. But I think if we look at how the engagement with concepts of informality has gone, we find that we start to excavate what is properly urban. What is the urban of associational activity, the emergence of new forms, the effect of assemblage and agglomeration. This is captured precisely in the work on informality that has classically come out of African context. So I'm suggesting that as we try to build our theorization of whatever urban politics is in these globalized platforms, we need to pay as much attention to specular, sort of disappearing politics as we do to more formal, bureaucratic, and certain dimensions. So, something to think about. Can we do that? What would it achieve for us? Is there something interesting there? I'll be curious to hear what people have to say about that. Now, the second point is if we turn from the circuits then to look at the processes of territorialization. Here, instead of having a predefined territorial entity, say a municipality, I want to suggest that we need to think about the way in which these potentially fragmented, dispersed, extended urban territories are emerging in the midst of globalized and interconnected processes. How do we think about the territorializations then of the urban? And here I've been most struck by a formulation coming from Ludovic Albert and his colleague René, thinking about what they call transcalar territorial networks. And here it also goes in the tracks of Gilles Pinson, who thinks about governing at the scale of the project. So where is it that governance, urban governance, is territorialized? Is it territorialized around a specific development project, around a fragment of the city? What is the territorializations that we'll be thinking about? And they suggest here how in a particular development, resources from multiple horizons are pulled together, from a fixed plot of land to capital allocated in distant investment committee boardrooms. So this just kind of scopes out two ends of this process. We can also jump into the Roger Kyle story about the global suburb, where he thinks about new kinds of eccentric parts of the city emerging in the midst of a multifarious connectivity, new centralities arriving here and there. So multiple globalizing circuits are shaping the future trajectory of urban settlements. And we might think of this, for example, in the sense that circuits might lead to repeated outcomes, the same iconic building arriving here, there, and everywhere, the same kind of design for a new city pitching up in South Korea and the edges of Addis Ababa, or in Lima in Peru. So how do we make sense of this? This is in a sense a kind of globalized same. Well, the work that we've been doing in London over the last 5 years is that even if we're looking at a kind of fragment of the city that is perhaps identical to many other, say, buildings that are identical to others that might be in different parts of the world, each of these buildings, in London anyway, it takes 2 to 3 years for the developers, the local state, the community, the planners to organize and negotiate and try and imagine and design and give permission for this thing to come forward. So this particular development then brings together, in the way that Ludovic Albert talks about, an array of different actors who become territorialized around this specific development that is coming forward. So what we're talking about then is some kind of dispersed territorialization process, which is attracting a transcalar association of actors. So we want then perhaps to think about the territorializations of urban politics, which might be individual buildings, large-scale developments, the production of new cities or satellite cities, or infrastructure itself, which is dragging urbanization along with it. So this, I think, is a very helpful starting point for us. And we could reach back to a different kind of political theory as well, around, say, regulation theory, and to think about perhaps how territorialization of forms of governance and might emerge on a territorialized basis through all the many different things that go to make up what is often a very obscure and complex formation of how things get done in cities, of how development comes forward. So thinking about all these different elements, the rules, the bylaws, prescriptions, the associations, the relationships. So here, Christian Schmid proposes a kind of old-fashioned regulationist way, in a sense, of trying to catch something of how it is that a certain territorialization of urban governance and politics comes together. So what does this mean for how we might think about then the politics of the urban? And here we get into some of the complexities. If you're thinking about a complex transscalar phenomenon, it's no longer easy to take apart what might be a kind of globalizing process, variegated or not, or a local interest or a locally dependent actor. And in the research, we did a comparison working with Fulong Wu, who works on Shanghai, and Phil Harrison, who works in Johannesburg. In Joburg, we looked at the corridors of freedom, which you've heard about just now. In Shanghai, we looked at this new satellite city, which is in the southeast of Shanghai. It's down here. This is the very southeast of Shanghai. This is the Lingang. And here, this seems to be a very grand kind of design for the city. It's around a 5-kilometer lake with a 5-kilometer diameter. It's gargantuan. And it has a sort of a funny narrative about it being the result of kind of dropping one little drop of water into the sea, and here this lake emerges. It comes out of a German design firm, and it's somehow in the lineage of garden cities. So we might read this as a kind of international architecture fest, a kind of globalization hitting the ground in Shanghai. But in fact, the reason why it was adopted was a very local reason. This was because in order to get their plan picked, the Chinese planners had to have something snazzy to grab the attention of the decision makers. The reason it looks like that has got nothing to do with garden cities and the Germans, although it's, but it was part of a local planning competition. So we have a kind of torsion, a complexity. How do we make sense of that? And in the case I've been working on in London, which is in northwest London, a planned new development of 30,000 homes and huge 60,000 odd jobs. Here we found a very funny kind of torsion too, where these very globalized architects and developers, very often very powerful, important firms doing many different things, their interest, their reference points, the precedents that they turn to, also the precedents of the planners, were all in London. I mean, this was kind of weird to us. So suddenly we're seeing this very global ambition being articulated through very parochial reference points. So we found here too a kind of torsion, and it also reflected itself in finding the interests of actors going in strange ways. So on the one hand, we have here a developer who thinks, oh, he wants everyone to be happy. Oh, why is that? I mean, in some way, it's kind of based in market interest. So people must be happy, they must like the development, and then he'll get more work, then somebody will buy the properties, and so on. So there's a market logic behind there. But it was also because these are kind of quite localized investments that people have. This is just an example of the so-called, international precedents of development that could be followed in Old Oak. And this is one that's not very far, a few miles away in South London, Elephant and Castle. So these were kind of torsions of a certain kind. I think there's also quite a practicality around mobilizing a transscalar imagination of development that has a diverse and open potential for what the territorializations are. And one of the practical issues comes down to this kind of rollout of the SDGs and the provocation, which I think is a very important one from Parnell, Peterson and others, which is that as we start to try and rethink the urban, we should be learning from development politics. We should be learning from policy, from the kind of policies that are coming forward to address the challenges of, say, urbanization across the continent of Africa. So that they suggest that really the dynamic edge of urban theorizing and of thinking of what politics is going to be places like Lilongwe, and is going to be policies like providing housing for the very poorest. But the difficulty is that development practice is stuck in a very staid sense of what urban governance and government is. Talking about multi-level governance, trying to fix certain kind of relationships between the local and the national, trying to formalize a hierarchical relationship, trying to fix the whole of municipal government is really not going very well. And this happens in the context of very powerful interests circling around these processes of urbanization, so powerful banking or financial investors, powerful property development companies, and very powerful sovereign entities circling around these investments. So in fact, developmental goals are bound up with what are very ambitious attempts to make money out of, to realize value from the very poorest cities in the planet. And I was very struck as I was preparing for a new research project which will be taking forward that kind of problematic. I came across this, which is a document signed between the Japanese, bringing forward, in fact, a master plan they were working on at the same time as the city strategy I talked about, and an agreement between JICA, the Japanese International Development Agency, and various people involved in Malawi's government, from the acting chief executive officer, so reflecting the very unstable form of government in place, and working its way up different kinds of agencies. And it's clear that we have really a transcalar set of actors, a transcalar organization of governance around the project of development in different poorer urban contexts. So instead of going with the idea that we must fix the whole of municipal government and we must have a proper relationship between national government and local government, actually, if we look at where is the development happening, what is going on, how is the development being brought forward in a particular urban context, and who's involved in it, what is the transcalar territorial network, and how could that be made to work effectively? So if you're building a new satellite city outside Nairobi, do you have to fix the whole of Kenyan government? Do you have to fix Nairobi's municipal capacities? No, but you need to, well, you may want to do that, but what you really need to do is to get a handle on the politics of this transcalar territorialization, which is yielding new forms of urbanization, which is where a lot of money is being made without any benefit to the people in that context. So how can one engage in this kind of transcalar politics to transform things? So I'll finish with a proposition that it is possible to take this diverse world of urban politics, transcalar, territorialized in different ways, associated with a range of different circuits, power relationships, and actors, much more diverse than what we've had in the kind of approaches we've inherited within the field. Can we move forward to try and build understandings of urban politics across different cases? And this is sharing with you very briefly some insights from the one aspect of the research project we just did, which is between London and Shanghai. So Shanghai, a big development linked to a deep water port with national government investment, and London, this old industrial area where there's now going to be, supposedly, assuming the B word doesn't have too great an effect on us, an HS2, a high-speed train going to the north as the tunnel train, the Eurostar coming to the east, and a crossrail train line going from the west of London to the city of London. So it's a major new transport node coming forward there. And what I've been very struck by in the work we did with our Chinese partners was how we might treat insights from the Chinese urban context as theory. So could we take forward concepts which come out of analyses of China and use them to help us understand our case in London? And the one insight that I found very helpful was this coming from Yu Tianxing, who talks about the urbanization of the state. So the urban processes are transforming what the state is and how it operates. And in London, we've had a situation where the state has been, the financing of the state has been rolled back to such an extent that the state now, where it was an outlier previously in terms of entrepreneurial stateness, is now having to secure its core welfare budget from urban development. So the state is increasingly entrained and enrolled in processes of urbanization and shaped by those, whereas before it had been very much a kind of centralized, top-down initiative. And the other thing that we found very interesting in our conversations between Shanghai and London was the way in which the Asian case really turns one's mind to the land interests of the state. The politics of the state's role, orchestration of, management of, and benefit from land. And Gavin Shatkin's work here, where he looks at 3 different contexts and thinks about how it is that the state's relationship to land varies across different contexts. So here we have a state-centered theorization coming out of Asia. And in London, we've had very little focus on what the state's interests are. So in London, we've spent a lot of time shouting at developers, shouting at the private sector for building high buildings, for not letting people have parks. We've shouted at global investors for leaving their apartments empty. We've had a very anti-developer focus. We haven't thought much about the state's interest at all. So coming from the context of Asia, one is focusing much more on the question of the state's interest in land. And Gavin Shatkin came up with this very interesting table where he thinks about situations where the state might have more or less control of land, situations where state land managers might have more or less autonomy to decide what is going on. So we can go from a situation where the state has little control and little autonomy, so is forced to work very closely with private sector actors, highly informalized, and contexts where there's very unroutine forms of land development, to the very top right-hand corner where you have highly autonomous land managers with a lot of control of land. And this fixes more, say, a Chinese context, for example. And in this box, in fact, he had a kind of question mark, thinking that maybe who could be there in this place where there's quite a lot of state control of land use, but less autonomy, that estate land managers are more controlled, perhaps by society, perhaps by democracy, perhaps by rules, and so on. And here I think this is where I felt that our London case fitted. That society, this was a context where the state has a lot of control over, for example, securing planning gain and determining what happens in land use, but also has some democratic constraints. So here I found that we could really thicken our understanding of the London case through thinking about analyses of Asian urban development politics as theory, as conceptual insights that we can draw on. So here, the urbanization of the state as a concept which helps us to think about how the local government in London is having to secure more and more of its income from the development of land through business rates, through securing planning gain from developers, and secondly, the state's interest in land, that increasingly the way in which the state tries to secure its gains from land is causing a lot of the poor outcomes that we're seeing, exacerbated by the territorial formation of governance. So here, how is it that governance is territorialized across different kinds of actors? And I'll just finalize by pointing out this thing about London, which you may be aware of, a highly fragmented local government, 33 different local government structures. But alongside that are these funny little bits of the city which have been kind of a red ring drawn around little bits of the territory, and they're called opportunity areas. So they're the same kind of things as you find across many deindustrialized European contexts, places that used to have ports or used to have industries, that now we can see, oh, he has an opportunity for development. And they're very haphazard. They pop up here and there. but they become sites for very intense development. And in concert with the way in which development is financed in London, which is largely through planning gain. So each time this kind of transcalar, territorialized form of governance emerges around a project or building, what is happening in those negotiations, which are often very secret, is that planners and the mayor are trying to pull out from the developer at the moment of construction. It's the only time they can get money out of them, to pull out the money to pay for. Usually planning gain might pay for some playgrounds or a bit of affordable housing, but now these must pay for the metro system, the train lines, the roads, must pay for healthcare, must pay for hospitals, must pay for schools. We are building the city with planning gain. It's an and in a way that is happening within these ring-fenced contexts. So what you find is an intense pressure on development in certain places to pay for that development. So when you go to London and you look at those very tall buildings, and you think this is really terrible, and how are we ruining our city? We are not only floating off from the EU, but we are floating off from any idea of having a kind of European-style urban situation. The reason is because here, the local authorities, the planners, the mayor, are trying to get all this stuff out of every development, leading to some outcomes which are really very challenging and problematic. And the last London plan, again, to come back to the idea of a city strategy, the mayor specifically is trying to implement a new policy in which not only are we having to use planning gain for all these outcomes, but the mayor is trying to prioritize his interests in affordable housing for his political gain, in infrastructure delivery, so Transport for London can be successful and lead to more development, before he pays for the things that we would normally expect planning gain to pay for, before he pays for things communities need, parks, playgrounds. Playgrounds in all these new buildings are on the roof, or in some, I'll quickly skip through to my favorite. I'm going to have to miss out quite a bit here. I've not left myself time for the example, as usual. But here, for example, to try and fit in more high-rise developments, more high-end housing that can pay for the bill of delivering the infrastructure and so on of this major new development. The one in Old Oak, the area I've been talking about, is going to be £2.5 billion worth of infrastructure investment, will have to be mostly paid for by the development itself, by extraction of planning gain. The outcome is these kinds of situations. Children must play in vertical cages, play on the roof. We don't need a lot of public space around our buildings and so on. So I think I found it extremely helpful as I've turned to try and understand the politics of London to pick up from our comparative study with China, the focus on the interests of the state and the particular way in which they're organized. How it is that we finance and fund the development in London through these little fragments of the city having to pay for their own developments, whereas in China the state can amalgamate its finances across a large area, across vast metropolitan areas, in large ongoing state-owned enterprises which can put past profits to future use. And Johannesburg also has a metropolitan-wide tax-based system in which strategic investments can be made in different places. So the particular territorialization of urban development, the way in which governance interests, transcalar interests are coordinated and organized, makes such a big difference to the outcomes in places. So this is, for us, why we found it very helpful to not only reconfigure the territorialization of politics, but to, as we start to think about and trying to understand that, to turn our eyes to other situations and allow them to shape and interpret how we notice processes and practices in our particular case. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
So, thank you, Jennifer, for your talk. And we'll ask you later what the fascinating missing slides are, but it's always inevitable, I think, with this kind of presentation. And it's very tempting to go on. But it's very fascinating, especially how you've moved between London, particularly as a centre, and China. Something we come back to in the discussion, possibly. And reminds me of a book housing in East Asia, social, economic, and demographic challenges. Ronald, 2014. Anybody? At this point, on that plug, I'd like to move on to the discussion and the respondents. And first of all, clarify that when I introduced Justus Uitermark at the beginning, that he hadn't written his introduction on the website. He was a victim of cut and paste from somewhere. But I would like to invite now Justus to come up and respond to Jennifer's wonderful talk. I think there's a bus going at this point.
Hi everyone. So I would like to thank the organizers of this event for inviting me to deliver some comments for discussion. And I would like to thank Professor Robinson for an engaging and stimulating lecture, and also for your work more generally, which has proven very inspirational for myself and many of the people I work with. So I'm going to try to play the part of the local expert and connect what Jenny has been talking about to the series of events this evening is a part of, which is the series of events in the honor of Sacco Mustard. And the events are about the European city. And so I must admit that when I first heard that you, Jenny, would speak, I couldn't really see the connection. In terms of empirical object, epistemology, or theoretical orientation, you and Sacco Mustard are worlds apart. Where your work is inspired by post-colonial and critical theory and grounded in cities of the global south, Mustard's work is positivist and mostly studies Dutch and other European cities. But upon further reflection, there is a connection. I think that an important part of Sacco Mustard, I hope he's watching through the live stream, Sacco Mustard's academic work has been to show that American theory doesn't always travel well to Europe. And your work is grounded in a very different tradition, but similarly argues that we would do well not to view all cities, including European cities, through theories developed in relation to American cities. I think both your work and that of Sacco Mustard argue for epistemological emancipation from American urban concepts. So let me explain from my personal experience how American theory has an ambivalent hold over our understanding of European cities. When I was a student of human geography at the University of Amsterdam, where Mustard was a professor, we read a bit about Belgium, a bit about France and Germany, and quite a bit about England. But the specter of American urban studies loomed large. We read about the Chicago School, the LA School, and we closely studied work from writers like Julius Wilson and Herbert Gans. The dominance of the US literature in the curriculum was rather ambivalent. On the one hand, we had to become intimately familiar with the canonical American contributions. But on the other hand, we were instructed not to apply their concepts. We read extensively on the ghetto, only to be told that the concept of the ghetto doesn't apply to Europe's disadvantaged neighborhoods. We studied gentrification and rent gap theory, only to be told that these concepts don't quite capture Europe's situation. We learned about the history of racial segregation in the United States, but again, the moral of the story was that the European city was really quite different from its American counterpart. So let me recount one anecdote that I hear every now and then. In the 1980s, so I was told, an American delegation was escorted around the Bijlmer neighborhood. The Americans had been told that the Bijlmer was like a ghetto, but upon arrival they told their Dutch hosts that they must have been taken to the wrong place. To their mind, the Bijlmer looked nothing like a ghetto. I now view this anecdote as a sort of academic folk myth that people like to tell each other to mark their difference from the US. Although the difference is real and important to note, the anecdote, and more generally the negation of the US experience, is also problematic. On the one hand, it can feed complacency in the sense that we're reassured that racism and inequality characterizes the United States, not us, confirming notions of Dutch innocence and excellence. On the other hand, the negation, the Bijlmer is not a ghetto, begs the question of what it positively is. So in this context, it's also interesting that Louis Quaquin describes the banlieue as an anti-ghetto, not as something as it really is, but as what it is not. So it is only in retrospect that I find this awkward. Until the moment I started preparing for this discussion, and that was yesterday, I had always thought of the Netherlands as belonging to Europe, and therefore to the West, and therefore in the same group as the US. And yet I would suggest that the memories I just recollected suggest just how much we, as scholars of Dutch and European cities, struggle with American concepts. A struggle, I think, that also motivated much of Sako Mustard's work on segregation and inequality. So in a long series of publications, he persistently and convincingly argued that English and especially American urban theory doesn't travel well to Europe, urging us in so many words to unlearn to view European cities through American eyes. And Professor Robinson's work then invites us to view the European cities not only as sites for qualifying or correcting American theory, but also as sites for the production of new concepts and theories. And so another exciting possibility opened up by the research program you just outlined is to look at European cities from elsewhere. So we looked at European cities through American lenses, and then we see that Dutch disadvantaged neighborhoods are economically and ethnically diverse by comparison. A valuable insight, to be sure. But what would happen if we see through a different set of lenses? Some scholars, including yourself, have begun to answer this question, observing, for instance, how informality, historically considered as characteristics of underdeveloped countries, is also operative in cities like London. I now also experience this as I think more about the Ghanaian capital of Accra. In one study of Accra with Joris Tieleman, we found that traditional authorities, chiefs in particular, play a vital role in urban development, both as mediators in governance networks and increasingly as landlords. We discovered that traditional authority did not recede as the modern state advanced. On the contrary, we found that the state actively supports the chiefs and ensures that new areas of the city are appointed a chief of their own. Ghana even has a ministry dedicated to the support of chiefs, the Ministry of Chieftaincy. I must admit that at first this seemed rather curious and alien to me. But as we discussed the case more, we discovered many parallels with the Netherlands, where traditional authorities, our royal family, have not only survived despite of the modern state, but perhaps also because of it, or at least that is what I was thinking after studying Accra. The royal family is, as in Ghana, shielded and supported by a thick layer of regulations and civil servants. And it is perhaps no coincidence that the largest private landlord in Amsterdam is a prince. The literature is now full of publications that ground theory in cases outside of the West. And so in this sense, I think that your research program and of your colleagues has been tremendously successful. And while I think there are good reasons why the need for epistemological emancipation is felt most strongly in former colonies, I think a case could be made that students of European cities might benefit from cutting the umbilical cord that binds us to Anglo-American urban studies. It is in this sense that the European city could become a site among many for new insights into cities. So before concluding, and for the sake of discussion, I would like to share with you two concerns and raise two questions. First concern. This is the propensity in some recent work in comparative urbanism to engage in what could be referred to as continental generalization. There is much talk of Latin American cities, African cities, Asian cities, Middle Eastern cities, and so on. And I just talked about European cities. Although these accounts are often presented as corrections of universal theory, in my view, their generalizations can be somewhat problematic. This also holds true, obviously, for a notion like the European city, which gives the impression that all cities in Europe have a number of distinctive features in common. What the sources of those distinctive commonalities are often remains difficult to decipher. And I think this stands in contrast to generalizations of the city, found in the Chicago School writings and in more recent work on the science of cities, which generally have a broader geographical reach but a narrower thematic focus. So here my concern is that I feel that comparative urbanism has convincingly cautioned against unwarranted generalization, while doing less to provide a sound basis for generalizations of its own. I have the impression that this happens largely ad hoc. My second concern relates to the need for new theory. So this is the argument that new empirical developments necessitate new theorisations. So I'm completely on board with the idea that what you refer to as the Harvey-Cox orthodoxy doesn't work anymore. But I would argue that Harvey identified one particular constellation. And the fact that that constellation can't be found anymore doesn't mean that the approach and the theories on which it is based have to be discarded. So there's a risk here that we also overstate what's new. So I don't think it's new that urban policies involve transnational policy networks and complex constellations of public and private partners. So this is true for any instance, also historically, of urban policy I'm familiar with. So here I feel that the possibility for parsimonious theory is foreclosed somewhat rapidly, which is problematic to the extent that it limits our capacity to observe and understand commonalities over time and across space. And now for my two questions. The first question. I find myself in agreement with what you say on theories of neoliberalism. I agree that such theorization often has difficulty defining core concepts. For instance, where does neoliberalism begin or end? And that it relies on under-theorized auxiliary notions like context for its explanatory power in concrete cases. But I would think that this is true for any theoretical notion. Perhaps an essential quality of a good theoretical concept is that it blinds us to almost all parts of reality to bring into sharp relief processes that by necessity cannot be observed in pure form. So I wonder if you agree with this. And if you don't, what your alternative criteria for a strong theoretical notion would be. Last question. In her book, Expulsions, Saskia Sasse describes her analytic strategy as a search for subterranean trends that operate across national boundaries and sectoral divisions. So I find this work stimulating and provocative because it identifies the common drivers behind very different phenomena, ranging from the proliferation of jurisdictional territories and the increasing sophistication of trading algorithms to foreclosures and the degradation of the biosphere. In my own interpretation, your emphasis on diverse practices and circuits precludes such a search for logic, overarching logics. And so I wondered, and it's a genuine question, if this reading is correct, or if you have perhaps a different way of identifying such logic. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Eustace, first of all for channeling Sacco Mustard into the room and then providing some great provocative questions. And I'd now like to invite Dr. Mamadou to also respond.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation and good evening, everyone. And thank you, Jen, for the very, very inspiring presentation, a very rich presentation and going in all kind of direction. Very difficult task, I think, to play the local expert, but fortunately in a very different way than Justice was doing. And I want to thank you for connecting to Sacco. And I'm a bit in between generations. So Sacco was a teacher for me too, but Eustace was a student of mine at some point. But as you said, I'm a political geographer, so I was not that convincing as Sacco to attract Eustace's attention. From all the things you told us this evening, I feel this tension between a very strong programmatic statement about we can start everywhere, and then from what you are talking about, all the processes you put forward, that you should not start from Amsterdam. It's not a very interesting city. not much going on. It's slow urbanization. It's not big, no big problems, not so much informality, strong state, a lot of fixed things there. So I feel a bit the ambiguity of your message, but I'll stick with the first one. We can start from everywhere. And in playing the local expert, I thought I could try to translate a few of the things you said to the Amsterdam situation, or at least Dutch cities or European cities, because London is actually maybe not such a European city anyway. So, I mean, we can think, not for long, you call it the big B word, so that's really bad. But of course, a lot of what you have said, as you say, the examples from resonate with things that are going on here. And of course, when you were talking about the way in London they try to get as much money as possible from these developers, and you think of the discussion we have in Amsterdam, or the debate we don't really have, but things which are happening with erfpacht, which I don't even know how it is. What is it? The English word for leasehold. And the way the leasehold system as now being given away in a certain way, with as baseline the worst possible year for making money for the municipality. So these things are also present here in a specific form. The circuit, the circulation of ideas is very, very also familiar. The networks, and I think it's I'm gonna want to talk about the networks, the way cities have some kind of agencies, and what cities are. You rightly point at the point that we should not think of cities as the municipalities only, but as a kind of constellation of actors. Maybe an assemblage is not the word you use. Maybe you can tell us in a minute why you don't use it. But these urban networks, this cooperation and competition through networks, generally focused on a specific topic, the sustainable development goals, but a lot of the climate cities. Think also of more general networks like Eurocities, which is very, very influential in European policy making, and the relations between the different levels. And then I was also asking myself, can we say something about what is specific to European cities in this comparative landscape that you open, this panorama that you have, you are opening for us. And there is something specific, I think, to the predicament of European cities, is that specific European level. So not only globalization, not only neoliberalism, not only other kind of architectural or urbanistic ideas are circulating, but we have this extra level, this supranational level, and the European Union has engaged specifically with the cities. So after 20 years of talk, we have an urban agenda for the European Union. And this is something that has gone a bit, under the radar. I don't know if a lot of people know about the urban agenda. I think a lot of people have absolutely not the idea that something spectacular is happening with the urban agenda. One of the reasons is actually the Brexit referendum, because the day the urban agenda was adopted in Brussels was the day after the referendum, so of course nobody talked about the urban agenda. But there is something going on there, because it's a new kind of partnership. It's a new kind of configuration between the different levels, and kind of light configuration between the European Commission, between the member states, the cities, and often also regions. And it might be actually very interesting from the point of view, the kind of questions you push forward to have a look at this urban agenda. Amsterdam has been particularly strong in that, not only because it has been developed during the Dutch presidency, where the meetings, many of the informal meetings of the European presidency were in Amsterdam, and actually even in Pakhuis de Zwijger. But also as a municipality has been very strong and is coordinating one of the partnership involved. So one of the questions, yes, is there something like a specific European experience of this circulation of ideas and this cooperation like the one you are describing? I was wondering, does Amsterdam as also a kind of adoptive city, like in the kind of relation you were describing between Johannesburg and Lilongwe? At some points there was something like that popping up with Ramallah, but this whole twinning with Ramallah and Tel Aviv and Amsterdam that was for national political reason did not came about in the end. The other question, of course, is the question of the diversity of European cities, and again, Justus already mentioned this, the very differences between cities in Europe, at least east-west, north-south, and many other kind of differences. And this brings me to the last one, which is the importance of the state. You do mention the state a lot, but in maybe because I'm a political geographer, I find it a bit of a vague kind of state. What are we talking about? It's not only about state and land rights. It's not only about rules and regulation. A lot of it is also about engaging people's sense of belonging, citizenship, political culture. And that will maybe come back to in your framework in terms of informality. And again, if you think of the Amsterdam experience, informality is back not when you look at the rules, the state architecture, the fact that the municipalities have not much autonomy. They are financially completely dependent, almost completely dependent from the central state. But you see informality coming back with the political culture, with the consensus seeking, the conflict avoidance, but also the gedoogbeleid, which again is a word I'm not sure how to translate. Oh no, that's not the right word. It's when things are forbidden, but we don't implement things. So this room that you get through the tacit agreement of everyone that is not the right thing to do, to really implement the rules how they are agreed, and it gives a lot of freedom, I think, in the case of Dutch politics to do things and to change things. And my last question is also about the state and the renationalization. Again, the B word, but also the fact that in many states in Europe at the moment we see political parties that are taking back things from, at least rhetorically, from the cities. So there is this contradictory movement that at the one end the cities are less policy takers and less rule takers than it used to be. They are more involved in the policy making, for example, as I said, with the urban agenda in the European policy making, but also in all kind of national urban policies. But at the other hand, we see a lot of movements, like in Hungary or in Poland and in other countries, taking back the agency to the national state and trying to mobilize people at the national borders. So I was wondering if you see this kind of phenomena also in your other cases, and especially in South Africa, where we have seen recently so quite some mobilization against migrants and so on.
So thank you to my learned colleagues there. Two wonderfully complimentary responses to the talk, and particularly responding to the last one. Yeah, we should ask political geographers to respond to urban geographers more often. And I would like to invite, I want to have some time for some public discussion, so I'd like to ask Jennifer to respond to the respondents within 4.5 minutes, ish. edited highlights. I'm sure you'll find a way.
Surprised you give me any time, but thank you. So I think, thank you so much. There's lots of great thoughts. I'm not going to be able to respond to all of them at all. I guess the one articulating point that comes out is around things like you talk about the continental generalizations. What is the European city? Can we talk about African cities versus a kind of the city and a big urban theory? And what do we do with the fact that whatever concepts we come up with will hide something from us, blinds us to some other thing? So we will always be a bit blind if we're using a concept. I would agree with that. So I would, in terms of thinking about the city, in terms of trying to understand urbanization and urban processes, I wouldn't be heading for a sort of universal theorization of the city. I also think a continental generalization is not very helpful. And the way in which I've tried to set out what I think comparison might be is precisely to work with what I think is an appropriate spatiality of the urban and one that our concepts might follow. That is an urban that is about circulating practices and ideas. So the urban is produced and found in these multiple interconnections, and also that the urban is repeated but different all the time, so that we're always going to find our concepts are losing something as they move around, that even if we're following a process that seems to be quite generalized, I don't know what the things were that Sasson was talking about, algorithms, foreclosure, I mean, sure, but my point is that these are not always exactly the same thing. And that if we get fixated on following stuff around, we lose sight of what's happening there. So in a particular context, and we lose sight of what the urban might be in its fullness, or what other places we should start thinking from. So in Accra, it's not surprising to me at all that we have so-called traditional authorities. They're not really traditional authorities. They're not really chiefs. This is a complex system of family-owned stool land, which it causes enormous problems of land ownership, titling, and so on. And it's a complete astonishment to me that Accra is full of investors from all over the world. Full also of the Chinese and the Indians and people, trying to make money out of the place. It's extraordinary when the land system is so unstable. So it's clearly a very important place to start thinking about urbanization in many African contexts. But that would be not enough to talk about urbanization in African contexts, because we also have highly financialized investors, we have the opening up of REITs in some contexts, we have very formal, very long-standing parts of cities in Africa. We have to think about the complexity of that. So in that case, the geography of the urban, the way in which we compose and think about it and conceptualize it, is not continental, it's not universal, it's not even about a territory of a city. So what I've been trying to say is that how do we build up conceptualization across the fragments, across the bits, across the this and that of the urban, something that emerges out of these multiple circuits, interconnections, contextual situations. The urban is such an unstable formulation, such an unstable thing. What could it be? I mean, Malik Simone has a wonderful way of talking about, the urban could be any kind of urban whatever could be emerging out of this system of interconnected processes and diverse outcomes. So I think the way in which I've tried to formulate how we might proceed with comparison, at some sort of limit point, I would say this is also a way of theorizing what the urban is, how we can see it, and how we can talk about it. It will be, of course, tracing connections and things we can see, things that might be relatively stable or appear in more than one place or be circulating through different actors, but also be highly differentiated and leaving us without being able to say a certain thing. I think that's certain, And this is the opening then for thinking the urban from any place, because we find the circuit anywhere and we find a difference and a new thing to think about as well. So this is, and I think if I just quickly make a point that the question that you pose, which is, can we learn from Amsterdam? Such a boring place. Now this is the end of the urban we won't think about. My point I was trying to make about London is that, in fact, through looking at our three cases, we see very different ways of organizing the financing, what I call the business model of three very large-scale developments. The London case is extremely odd. idiosyncratic, bizarre. Why would you build a city on planning gain extracted only at the point of construction? There's no ongoing tax on land value. There's no ability to reclaim the profits of the developer. It's a pathetic little instrument, and it's pressed to the extreme. And we see what the city looks like as a result, and it's pressed by the planners. The planners say, build higher, build more. The developers say, well, this isn't going to be a good development. So this, it's a very idiosyncratic system. But what it shows us by putting these three quite different business models into comparison is that as we think about the way in which developers are rushing to Accra or Lilongwe or Dar es Salaam, which is the other case we're going to be looking at, rushing to make money out of the poorest places with very insecure urban governance systems, what are the choices that people have about the kinds of ways in which we organize value capture, organize governance, organize the territorialization of urban development? So I think this, for me, yes, we learn from all these different places, but we don't learn about them because it's a European city, but because we're looking at to understand a specific element of urbanization or a specific outcome. So I don't like either to talk about global south and north. I think these are extravagant generalizations which really don't start to answer our questions. So yeah, that's a few thoughts, lots more. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and also for being wonderfully concise but explanatory at the same time. I'd like to, at this point then, open up the discussion to the room more broadly. And maybe, Jennifer, you'd like to stand up at the front. I'm going to give you the opportunity to respond. I presume the questions are going to come to you. Okay. But I'm happy to give Eustace and Virginie the mic at some point. There's clearly a metro leaving any second now. Some of the people have so are there, first of all, questions? I'm going to have about 10 to 15 minutes of a chance for people to, from the room, to pick the minds of the speakers today. Well, please take a microphone and express.
Thank you. I'm based in the Netherlands doing research at TU Delft, but I'm originally from South Korea, and when I see that you draw some theories and learning from the analysis of Chinese cities in terms of land monetization, capture value from land, and you try to use that framework to further analyze maybe London's case, and I think that makes very much sense because you said London's case is idiosyncratic, but when I look at Seoul, the capital of South Korea, the very similar things is happening there also. The pre-negotiation before mega development and how to extract money from. So basically, it's also based on planning gain in order to make the city and provide urban infrastructure. And I was a bit surprised by Virginia's comments that you mentioned Amsterdam is quite maybe different case or boring, but when I see how development is going on in Amsterdam, there are much more similarities and issues in terms of land monetization also. Even though the tax base is very much dependent on the central government, Amsterdam is drawing on also basically kind of land value increment in the process of urbanization, land provision by the government. So when the municipality sells the land to developers, they consider financial interests are a crucial thing. So maybe social housing provision that's why it's set aside. Yeah, because the city has to sell land at the higher prices. So I think, I have a different idea. So I think Amsterdam is a good case to start. We can discuss later more.
Thank you. So it's a tough, well-informed audience. Jennifer, would you like to respond to that, or first of all? You have a mic.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that's a very good contribution. I think what we were struck by is how, in our three cases, value needs to come forward from urbanization to produce urbanization. So this is not a new idea. So we produce the urban out of the value that the urban offers us. But how that is configured can be very different. And so in Shanghai, for example, it was configured as capturing the value from new enterprises that were being developed, so to try and promote economic growth, and taking the tax on the output of those enterprises and consolidating that to pay for the development, or taking some of the reserves of the state-owned enterprises who didn't have to make a big profit, who just had to not lose money. Okay, and in Johannesburg, at the other end, the ways in which they financed it was also through development loans from the French Development Agency, through some municipal bonds, through marshalling their municipal-wide tax receipts. But the main way in which the specific developments could come forward for low-income housing in the center of the city was by keeping land values very low, so that you could formulate a low-income housing model. So it was really the opposite from London. So for these three, then we see different ways in which urban value, if you think about it more generally, is able to be mobilized to try and enable some kind of urbanization project. And so we were struck by this diversity. And so if I'm thinking about, you know, the kind of developmental ambitions of some very poor cities who are beset by huge developers, how could you think in governmental or development terms about bringing forward a realization of urban value capture, so more than land value capture, to the benefit of the city? And so, you know, the way in which it's organized, say, in Hong Kong or in Ethiopia, auctions of land in Singapore and so on, these also have different configurations, and they also enroll the national state differently, which comes back to the discussant's comments there. You know, so this can also mobilize a national appropriation of wealth from the urban for whatever project they have going on. So there's a lot at stake in urban value, but its configuration and organization is, I think, it's very important to be aware then of the different ways in which that can happen.
Thank you. Are there any more comments, questions? Yeah? Sorry, Myra, I wait for my mic. Yeah.
Kind of based on your work, I sort of expect the answer you're going to give me, but I want to hear from you since you're here. Anyways, working on context outside, again, I don't like the word just like you said, but I'm going to use global south just to generalize. Writing from that perspective or trying to work on this context, we often find some resistance also from publishers or from journals to not engage with a literature that is based in the US or sometimes even other European contexts. So this is something we're often pushed to. We get comments from reviewers or things like that on, okay, but that's happened in the US since whenever, so why are you not building on that? Or you're supposed to build on this because in London in the 18th century, you know, these have been comments I have received. And so how do you think we can push back on that as scholars working maybe on contexts outside the global north, or however you want to call it? And if what you're proposing is almost a cultural change in the discipline on how we do it. And then if, since you mentioned that you're working on China and London as comparative cases, if comparative cases is a way to start this introduction of these cases that are less debated or that are often overlooked in the overall literature or something like that. I don't know if it's clear.
Yes.
Sure. I mean, that's a really big issue. So I think the first one is, how do we make that shift in the practice of international publishing? And it's really quite urgent, and it's really hard to resist that desire to impose a certain literature, also a certain way of writing. So Sue Parnell and Edgar Peterson in IJO, they did write about the need for an openness to quite different kinds of academic work. So, we're also talking as two scholars based in the North who are trained in a certain way, have certain time and resources to read what we like, to find the things to read, not to have a second or third job. We don't have to do so much of consultancy and stuff. But scholars in poorer contexts, they're incentive structures, the things that are important to write about, the things that are important to know, what is really original in a place. It's not that you can debate a point with David Harvey, it's that you can write something that's going to speak directly to the situation at that time. It doesn't need all that theoretical work, but it will be coming forward with conceptualizations that are embedded, with ways of approaching a problem, and with very important information that we just don't have. I mean, we frankly have quite lots of information about Amsterdam, but not very much about Lilongwe in our journals. So how is it that we bring forward work that does not have to have those reference points at all? I think it's very important that journals change their approach completely. I feel very strongly about that. And I sort of think that we have to start to make a much stronger move in that direction. Otherwise, frankly, our journals will just be irrelevant. Other journals will be emerging in India, in China, in publishing projects across sub-Saharan Africa, which are underway. What Ananya Roy so helpfully called the new subjects of urban theory. These are concentrated and emerging and very productive, and our work will become useless. So we have to change. I feel very strongly about that, as you can tell. The question about comparison, I mean, I used very advisedly the idea that I would like to turn to the Chinese literature as theory. Not because it's another empirical case that I can carefully compare and say, oh, well, here we have a bargained authoritarian state, and here we have a post-political, late democratic state, and Actually, no. I found something very focused, looking at how state interests are articulated, what it is that states do in relation to urban land development. And what I was very struck by is if you're looking at a context that's full of state activity, states are doing everything. State actors are the developers, the policymakers, the regulators, the investors. The state, you're right, it's a vague idea. But thinking with that, looking with that conceptual lens on London, I suddenly opened up this planner or the state, many different things. One, policymakers. The planners or policymakers are very nice. They come to the meetings, they're very friendly, they come up with community-friendly visions. Planner number 2 is a development control person who sits down and negotiates with the developer and is trying to get a lot of money out of the developer and out of the development and out of pushing back community demands. Very tough. And now we have a mayor who wants to be a developer and who is starting to build his own build-to-rent around every transport node in town, and he will be fighting the community for his planning gain income. So the state has different roles and different interests. And in that context, for me, I've been pushed back by a couple, in a couple of places that's not appropriate, and I have to be much more careful about why would I learn from, why would you take something from China when it's such a different kind of context and such a different kind of state? But are you looking at a very specific relationship between urbanization, the development of land, and how state actors are using what are very common but differentiated ways of appropriating value and organizing the development. So I think we can use Chinese scholars as theory just as much as we can use Kevin Cox. So, Columbus, Ohio has a lot to answer for in the world of urban theory. And I think we should be allowed to learn from other cases as conceptual innovations as well as careful, empirical, detailed cases. Yeah.
Thank you. As it's almost into 10, I'm going to take all the questions left in the room at one go. So speak now, or save it until the bar is the options. So are there any more questions? We have one here. The best question. There we go.
Well, thank you. It was a very interesting presentation, and I was particularly interested in this second point, that the diversity of circuits. We have been in Brazil investigating fast-growing cities in the Amazon rainforest, and we are struggling there to find keys to analyze as Milton Santos says, the two circuits of economics, the higher circuits of the soya beans value chain there, and all the consequences of territorial change that they are going to happen there, and also the impact in the lower economic circuits that the traditional populations living there, the interference that was occurring. So I would love to hear if you have some perspectives of how to understand this kind of interferences in these multiple circuits as a methodological challenge in investigating these aspects. For us, was very interesting this discussion of multiple circuits, and I think I was very interested in your presentation in this point.
Thank you.
There's one more.
One more? Yes.
I don't have any ambition to defend David Harvey, but I have a question about it, because about especially neoliberalization. Because what I think is that when David Harvey tries to emphasize that concept is about, he wants to bring out about the class dimension. So every time when we leave somewhere out neoliberalization processes, or like when we want to look at something else, as in your case, what happens to class relationships, or what happens to class struggle?
There's a big question.
that is a big question to finish on.
I think it's a good point, because I don't know whether David Harvey has to link neoliberalization to class struggle. That would be one big part of the question, and I suppose he talks about it as a way of reasserting class power of capital and the rich. Neoliberalization, I think when you follow it in its articulation with other kinds of circuits, it can have a very different outcome. And so this is the work of James Ferguson, for example, looking at the case of South Africa and learning from many South African scholars, actually, and people also working in poorer contexts where neoliberal governance tactics and strategies could well be good ways of bringing forward developmental interventions, So does that necessarily have a class dimension? I would say that you also have to look at some of the power relationships that are not about class. So in South Africa, some of the techniques of distributing, for example, water are not about class power, but an astonishing way in which the post-apartheid state has been willing to impose quite an oppressive form of power on its own citizens by insisting that they pay for water, get cut off from water when it's not apparent. It's an extraordinary relationship. And it is like really almost defies articulation of what is going on there. But I find it hard to see that as a class politics. So that's a big question. Whether we need to look at class as well, another question altogether. So what kinds of power relationships are important in different contexts? So I guess coming back to the multiple circuits question, I think that's a very interesting point to come back to Milton Santos's work on there being different kinds of circuits of economic activity, classically more formalized, less formalized, with different kinds of intersections. Why not? One of the things that I found very interesting about work in Brazil is that it's looked a lot at the circulation of, until the recent election, the circulation of lots of inventive approaches to policy, to urban policy, to development policy, and how these have been put into the world. So some great work by a guy called Asmani Porto de Oliveira in Sao Paulo, looking at participatory budgeting, for example, and other kinds of innovations which have circulated around the world. And also, I think what looking from Brazil and other such contexts might do is hook us into a different literature, which is where some of the points I was making about the specular forms of global urban practice, say from the Lilongwe-Joburg partnership, comes out of a development studies literature, where there's been a lot of work on the kinds of complex relationships that are articulated between different actors in international development, and has a very rich repertoire of ways of thinking about the globalized practice. So I thank you. I think these are really interesting points to think about.
So thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Professor Robinson. Thank you, Yusuf Sajmak. Thank you, Virginie Mamadou, for your contributions this evening. And thank you all for your questions and for your attention. I think some people might be going to the bar to discuss things further. It's a possibility. I'd like to thank again the Centre of Urban Studies for their sponsorship of the event, and to Wouter van Gent and Willem Boterman for organising the whole thing, and to remind people that this is part of actually a number of events over the next few days. There is a seminar tomorrow, and some people are already signed up for that. And there's also on Friday a valedictorian in the University of Amsterdam Aula for Professor Sacco Mustard at 4 p.m. And there's lots of seats, so I don't think they'll throw you out, and Sacco, I'm sure, would appreciate no hecklers, but appreciate the support. And I'd like to finish by, again, thanking Professor Jennifer Robertson, particularly for coming and giving us her wonderful speech. Thank you. Curated.